important reference guide for Malaysia in formulating policies, improving governance and sustaining economic growth. The report also aligns with the initiative introduced under the Economy Madani, the 12th Malaysia Plan and the new Industrial Master Plan 2023-2030, to name a few. Ladies and gentlemen, in closing, once again, I would like to extend our gratitude to Dr. Luis Di Mello, Director of Country Studies at the Department of Economics of the OECD and his team. Our greatest appreciation also goes to all the relevant ministries, agencies and institutions for their invaluable inputs and feedback and in completing this very important report. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zunika, for the welcoming remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to invite Dr. Luis Di Mello, Director, Country Study Branch, Economics Department, OECD, to deliver OECD remarks and presentation of the 2024 OECD Economic Survey Malaysia. Dr. Luis.
Minister Rafizi, Deputy Secretary General Dr. Zunika, Deputy Secretary General Dr. Yatima, Deputy Secretary General Lukman, Her Excellency Mrs. Karima Al-Puri, United Nations Resident Coordinator from Malaysia, esteemed panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be back in Malaysia for the launch of our 2024 Economic Survey of Malaysia. I can only join the words of Dr. Zunika in thanking all of you for the great collaboration that we've had and the very warm hospitality that we received today here in Malaysia. The relationship between Malaysia and the OECD has grown stronger and stronger over the years. Today's launch marks the 4th time the OECD publishes an economic survey of Malaysia. The survey compares economic performance with some of the world's leading economies and tries to build on the experience of OECD member and non-member countries to put forward options to address the economic policy challenges that Malaysia is facing today. We would like to thank the Malaysian government for their outstanding support in preparation of the survey, especially the continued collaboration with the Ministry of Economy, but also many other ministries and public agencies whose collaboration was vital to make this report a success. Let me turn now to a few highlights of this economic survey. Malaysia has achieved remarkable economic and social progress over the past decades, and that's evidenced from the chart that you can see on the screen. The economy's strong economic performance is paving the way for faster convergence in living standards relative to more prosperous countries in the OECD area. Sustained and inclusive economic growth for half a century has brought Malaysia close to the threshold of high-income status, and Malaysia is expected to reach that threshold soon. Malaysia has also been ahead of regional peers in terms of per capita income, and has been able to consolidate this lead over the last 3 decades. Significant policy reforms in the 80s allowed Malaysia to attract significant inflows of foreign direct investment, turning it into a global chips and electronics manufacturer. Malaysia is now well placed to build on this progress. Recent changes in the configuration of global value chains may further strengthen inflows of FDI and exports in the country. At the same time, as a highly open economy with exports amounting to 3/4 of GDP, Malaysia is vulnerable to external shocks. Improving labor market conditions supported private consumption during most of last year. Unemployment fell from a peak of about 5% during the pandemic to just above 3% which marks a return to pre-pandemic levels. This has allowed significant improvements in the remuneration of workers. Inflation took off in early 2021, driven by global supply chain bottlenecks, soaring global energy and commodity prices, and the depreciation of Malaysia's currency. Headline inflation peaked at 4.7% in April 2021, but remained below that of neighboring Thailand and Singapore. Admittedly, energy subsidies are one explanation for this more moderate spike in inflation, as they have contained the transmission of higher global energy prices to the domestic price level in Malaysia. But this has come at a significant cost to the budget. Inflation has now returned to 2% as food price increases decelerated, and it is projected to remain moderate amid easing global supply chain constraints and lower commodity prices in general. Against this background, the current broad neutral monetary policy stance seems appropriate in the near term. Exports of goods declined in 2023, mainly reflecting lower external demand for key products that Malaysia exports. While to some extent this mirrors developments in other countries in the region and beyond, Malaysia was affected more than other peers and has not regained its earlier strong export growth. Let me turn to how we see the outlook for the Malaysian economy over the near term. Despite multiple challenges, such as the pandemic and supply chain disruptions, the Malaysian economy has remained resilient. Output increased steadily in the first 2 quarters of 2024, with year-on-year growth accelerating to close to 6% in the second quarter of this year. For the whole year of 2024, growth is projected at 4.9% and 4.7% next year. Domestic demand will be the primary driver of growth, supported by low inflation and favorable labor market conditions, even though the fiscal stance will be mildly restrictive. Inflation will rise moderately as subsidies are being withdrawn, but will remain low. Monetary policy is expected to remain broadly neutral, in line with our recommendations in this survey. Let me say a few words about the public finances. Malaysia has a reputation for prudent fiscal policy making, but there are longer-term challenges that will need to be addressed. Let me take you through some of them. Looking at the last few years, fiscal policy started to consolidate as growth recovered from the pandemic shock. The federal government deficits, both headline and primary, have declined consistently as of 2021. A new fiscal framework passed last year is a major step towards stronger fiscal accounts. The new framework calls for a federal government deficit below 3% of GDP and gross debt below 60% of GDP. We believe that this new framework, however, could be made stronger by expanding the fiscal framework to cover the consolidated public sector, whose fiscal deficit has exceeded that of the federal government since the year 2020, sorry. State-owned enterprises and other extra budgetary entities contribute 30% of Malaysia's GDP and could be also covered in this new framework. Like many other economies, Malaysia will face strong spending pressures from population aging, rising demands for social protection, and the costs of transitioning towards net zero carbon emissions. Ensuring long-term fiscal sustainability will therefore require additional fiscal policy measures to offset these expected costs. In the absence of compensatory measures, these additional spending pressures would put public debt on an unsustainable trajectory over the next 2 or 3 decades, according to our calculations. Fiscal measures will need to be taken to ensure compliance with the new fiscal framework and keep debt below the 60% threshold by the middle of this century. At 23% of GDP, Malaysia's public spending and public revenues are low relative to the size of the economy, at least by comparison with OECD countries. There is therefore only limited scope to reduce public spending without compromising important policy objectives. There is one exception to this, though, which is the case of subsidies. They are mainly about energy and fuel in the case of Malaysia. The subsidies have seen a threefold increase over the last year to 3.5% of GDP in 2023. In per capita terms, this makes Malaysia's fuel subsidies the highest in the region. The challenge, in our view, is that fuel subsidies are usually not a very effective way to protect vulnerable households from price increases, as most of the benefits tend to accrue to households with higher incomes. Targeted transfers to vulnerable households could do a much better job at a lower fiscal cost. On top of that, fuel subsidies created the wrong incentives for achieving carbon emission reductions, as they reduce the price of carbon emissions. Besides reducing subsidies, a large part of the fiscal action needed to ensure longer-term sustainability will need to happen on the revenue side of the budget. Malaysia has a scope for mobilizing more revenue, in our view, as tax receipts account for only 12% of GDP. This will require changes to the tax system. And taxes on goods and services can play a central role in this endeavor. These taxes raise only about 2.8% of GDP in Malaysia, which is less than a third of the respective revenues from these taxes in the OECD area. Most OECD countries have made value-added taxes a central pillar of their tax system, because these taxes are friendly to economic growth and create very little distortions in the economy overall. And also because they are relatively simple to enforce and difficult to evade. Malaysia could follow this OECD best practice by reintroducing the GST, which was abolished in 2018. The rate could initially be kept low to avoid the problems that marred the introduction of this tax in 2015. The potential regressive redistributional effects of higher value-added tax could be offset through well-targeted social transfers to vulnerable households whose real purchase power could be affected by the tax. This could be complemented by a broader tax base of personal income taxes, which currently are only paid by about 15% of the labor force, and also further improvements in tax administration. Let me turn to a second issue that we deal with in the survey, which is about creating better opportunities for Malaysians. Let me touch upon some structural issues, starting with social challenges. In many respects, Malaysia is a success story of social inclusion. Poverty has declined consistently over the decades as the economy has grown, and has now dropped to around 6%. Income inequality, however, remains relatively high relative to many peer countries, as shown on this chart by the Gini coefficient. While the Gini has fallen from a high of 56 in 76 to 40 in 2014, the decline has stalled since then, and the number has hovered around 40% over the last 10 years or so. We believe that public policies could do more to improve equality of opportunities in this country. The impact of taxes, transfers, and subsidies on inequality is less than in other countries that we see in the region and beyond, as you can see from this chart. Benefit levels are often low to make a real difference for the livelihoods of vulnerable households, and social assistance is overall very fragmented and not very well targeted. Subsidies are a particularly ineffective social policy tool, as I mentioned a few slides ago, as more affluent households receive a larger share of the subsidies than those at the bottom of the income distribution. Shifting social spending from subsidies to well-targeted and unified social assistance benefits would support improvements in social inclusion. Another issue to bear in mind is that of pension coverage in Malaysia, which by comparison with other countries is rather narrow. More than 60% of the population are not covered by any pension scheme, and those who are often fail to receive a decent pension. Rapid population aging will reinforce the need for stronger and more sustainable pensions, not only here, but in most of the countries that we have been working on. Non-contributory social assistance pensions could help fill the current coverage gap in the future, but they currently have low coverage and low benefit levels. A stronger role for non-contributory pension benefits would also reduce the need for social contributions paid by low-wage workers, and hence strengthen the incentives for creating formal jobs. Let me turn to gender employment. Malaysia also has a gap in that respect, in regional context and by comparison with other countries around the world. That gap has been widening over the last 5 years. To give you an indicator, labor force participation is more than 26 percentage points higher among men than among women. This is one of the largest gaps in this region. One of the reasons that keeps more women from joining the labor market is the time spent on unpaid domestic care, especially on children. That's the case in other parts of the world as well. This burden, unfortunately, falls disproportionately on women, and even more so in Malaysia than in OECD countries. Improving access to affordable child care would therefore allow more women to work. We are seeing that this is a very powerful tool in many parts of the world. Countries where child care is more broadly accessible and at a lower cost are countries where labor force participation gaps tend to be very narrow between men and women. Let me say a few words about MSMEs. We heard lots of very interesting comments, analysis, and insights on the panel a moment ago. But let me just recap the main messages that we wanted to highlight in the survey. Many Malaysians work in small firms or are entrepreneurs. This survey contains a special chapter that takes a closer look at policies that can help micro, small, and medium enterprises harness their full potential, which would contribute to stronger growth and productivity in this country. Low productivity has been a headwind in Malaysia's progress towards high income status, as productivity growth has slowed over the last 3 decades. Productivity is particularly low in micro, small, and medium enterprises. In those enterprises, labor productivity has been only around 2/3 of that of larger companies. Malaysia's hundreds of programs to support MSMEs, but the effectiveness of those efforts has been held back by their fragmentation, a lack of coordination, and an excessive targeting on specific sectors, location, or ownership. Scaling up MSMEs is a key to increase their productivity, but it's difficult to determine which companies will be able to achieve this high growth. The survey therefore suggests to shift the focus towards creating the right framework conditions that enable a wide range of firms to achieve stronger growth. Let me say a few words about what we mean here. Burdensome regulations can limit the growth of smaller firms and their ability to scale up. Compliance costs with licenses and permits, estimated at about 2.3% of GDP, fall disproportionately on smaller firms and can be an obstacle to their growth and formalization. Malaysia's product market regulations are more restrictive than in peers limiting competition and entry. The way to read this chart is basically an indicator of the OECD that tries to measure how restrictive regulations are in product markets. So the higher the number there, the more restrictive regulations tend to be in a country. So the objective that we say in many parts of the world is, let's try to make product market regulations less restrictive, allowing entry in sector, allowing contestability in the economy, that creates conditions for economic growth and for smaller firms to scale up. A large state-owned enterprise sector remains an obstacle to competition, particularly for small companies, in our view. Preferential treatment and subsidies can crowd out private investment, especially in industries where public enterprises are dominant. There may be a case for reevaluating the costs and benefits of state-owned enterprises in sectors where the private sector is operating efficiently. Meanwhile, it's important to ensure a level playing field between SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and private sectors in the private sector to strengthen competition and support the growth prospects for smaller firms. "85% of Malaysian SMEs are in services, of which nearly half are in the retail sector. This is a sector where firms face stricter and less competition-friendly regulations than the OECD average. Further regulatory reforms to ease these barriers would strengthen competition." That's the experience that we are seeing in many parts of the world. Many SMEs operate in those sectors where regulations sometimes tend to be more restrictive, which creates a normal or a natural obstacle for enterprise growth in parts of our economies that tend to be very big. Let me say a word about the digitalization, another topic that was dealt with in the panel. The ability to harness digitalization is a distinctive feature of small firms that successfully manage to scale up. For MSMEs, digitalization can be a game changer, allowing them to compete on a more equal footing with larger firms. Stronger competition in telecoms and in computer services, for example, including by easing foreign entry restrictions, could improve the limited take-up of digital solutions among smaller firms. Let me turn to the last topic that we deal at some length in the survey, which is about climate change. This is a challenge that the world is facing. This is not a particular issue of Malaysia. It's a topic that we've been spending more and more time discussing policies and challenges with countries. Malaysia is particularly prone to extreme weather events, such as floods, heat waves, and storms. And the frequency of such events has been rising. Addressing climate change challenges will therefore be key for Malaysia, both when it comes to mitigating policies and also adaptation policies. Let me turn to the mitigation side of the equation. Greenhouse gas emissions have been rising in recent years, and stronger policy action will be required to reach Malaysia's emission reduction targets. Energy use remains the primary source of emissions in this country, accounting for about 80% of the total. At the same time, land use and forestry have been absorbing carbon dioxide. They work like normal natural sinks, helping to mitigate emissions in Malaysia. So how can we do more to mitigate climate change through a reduction in emissions in Malaysia? Greenhouse gas emissions in this country remain high relative to peer countries, as you can see from this chart. One key instrument used across OECD countries to rein in emissions is carbon pricing. Malaysia currently has no mandatory carbon pricing measures or fuel taxes, which makes it an outlier in this chart when you are comparing different countries, when you see that effective carbon rates tend to be much higher in most of these countries on the chart. Instead, subsidies have encouraged energy consumption and promoted rising emissions. Introducing carbon pricing would help Malaysia, in our view, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, while targeted transfers could cushion their social impact and facilitate policy support. Here again, a link to the point about subsidies that I made a few slides back. More stringent environmental regulations could also help to support decarbonization in Malaysia. Malaysia's current environmental regulations are less stringent than in the OECD areas, and also by comparison with some countries in the region, including Thailand and Indonesia. So we believe that there is more that can be done to make sure that environmental standards and norms are more stringent in support of decarbonization. Let me say a word about renewable energy. The energy sector remains the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in Malaysia. Fossil fuels like natural gas, oil and coal still dominate the energy matrix, while renewable energy sources account for less than 4%, which is lower than in other countries in the region. Accelerating the rollout of renewables will be pivotal for transition into a low-carbon economy, and Malaysia can build on earlier progress in both solar energy generation and biomass, for example. Streamlining licensing procedures and a wider use of electricity auctions could help to promote renewables, in our view. While the power generation market has been gradually deregulated since the early 90s, the experience of OECD countries shows that a full unbundling of electricity generation, transmission, and distribution can further accelerate the deployment of renewable energy sources. Let me conclude, dear Minister, guests, authorities, by stressing the fact that our economic survey provides policy recommendations across 4 key areas that I mentioned throughout this presentation. Macroeconomic policies, inclusive growth, climate challenges, and finally raising small enterprises' productive potential. We hope that our analysis can help Malaysia to learn from the experience of other countries, including OECD member economies, to build on its own progress over the years, and consolidate its path towards becoming a high-income economy. At the OECD, we stand ready to continue to our collaboration and to support Malaysia in its growth, in its path towards stronger, more inclusive, and more sustained growth. We learned a lot about the experience of Malaysia when we had the opportunity of discussing the survey in the committee, when we had the visit of Malaysian officials to present their policies, to discuss with their peers their challenges and the way they see the future for their economy. We hope that Malaysia has also learned from that discussion, and we look forward to a 5th economic survey and to be able to, in the meantime, maintain this dialogue with you, which we found extremely productive and extremely exciting. So thank you very much again for your hospitality and for all the very productive collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luis, for the remarks and presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to invite Yang Berhormat Rafizi Ramli, Minister of Economy, to deliver a keynote address. Please welcome.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good afternoon. Dr. Luis Melo, Director of Country Studies at the Department of Economics of OECD, TKSUs, Dr. Zunika Muhammad, Dr. Luqman Ahmad, Dr. Suhana, Director of Macroeconomics Division, Ms. Karima, UN Resident Coordinator for Malaysia, officers from OECD, fellow senior officials from various ministries, ladies and gentlemen. Let me thank OECD to begin with, as well as all the ministries and agencies across Malaysia for this long-standing collaboration. and the result of which, and this is the fourth survey, we've been blessed with insightful analysis and recommendations that had guided our policy making. And this year's 2024 economic survey is no exception, with a focus on inclusive growth, climate challenges, and especially to scale up MSME. And we are at a good junction because the Ministry of Economy is working on the next 5-year plan for Malaysia. And while some of the recommendations and issues are known to us, one particular new focus for the next 5-year plan is on building resilience and scaling up our MSMEs. Coming up to almost 2 years in government, it is important to take stock of the economy's performance. It's just about the right time horizon where we are seeing our policies have an effect from ordinary people to financial markets. About 20 months ago, when this administration first entered office, inflation was about 4% and eroded household spending. This meant that any GDP growth was being driven by a recovery-based effect, not private consumption or investments. Exports were in the negative and the tourism industry was still reeling from the pandemic. It is easy to forget how gloomy the state of affairs was, and the last 20 months included 2 heart attacks for me and 1 spinal surgery. That was how intensive the last 20 months was, because we came from a very low base to begin with. 20 months on, Malaysia is showing signs of a turnaround. The recent 5.9% GDP growth is the highest in 6 quarters, and inflation has been tamed to around 2%. Importantly, this was driven by higher household spending, anchored by an expansion in wages and employment growth. Tourism is almost 30% higher year on year, and exports are positive again. In that interim period, what transpired was a careful discussion of priorities. We had to constantly ask ourselves, given all the complications, what are the 20% of policies that could improve the 80% of the economy? Policies that could unlock value and revitalize investor confidence in our economy. Policies that could trigger growth, but also create economic resilience amongst the most disadvantaged in our society. This meant we had to take some rather radical positions, and I was glad that by and large, perhaps it went better than we expected. It was a lot quieter than we expected when we discussed all these policies behind closed doors. And if we look back, most of the decisions were never attempted before, at least not in a short space of 20 months. The rationalization of subsidies in food, electricity and diesel. And I think we sometimes forget that in the last 20 months, the administration had retargeted subsidies in food, in electricity and also diesel. And that was a breakaway from decades of practice, and it was considered politically suicidal to even go near any of them. But it was done, and of course the judge is out there, and I hope we will continue on the current trajectory, but at the very least, we have saved 10 billion of government budgets that had been retargeted to better administered and better targeted programs. And yet, bold structural reforms don't necessarily translate to rapid outcomes. If anything, that was the biggest fear. We had to go on this path, and a lot of our problems were structural in nature. And because they are structural, most probably it will take a while before we start seeing the results. And I keep telling myself, and I keep telling my team at the Ministry of Economy, and I keep pleading to the Cabinet that turning around the economy, given all these structural challenges, requires patience and a belief in staying on the path. And to recognize that even with the right decision making, our open economy will continue to be vulnerable from, for example, the federal interest rate. For example, whatever the trajectory of Chinese economy in the next 2 to 3 quarters. And even as our ringgit was tumbling last year, we doubled down on our economy agenda. Just to share with Dr. Luis, one of perhaps the most unpopular stand that we take was that if we are confident on our fundamentals and we are confident that our policies will rectify progressively the structural defects, whatever developments in our market, we have to ride it through. Do not respond haphazardly to short-term vulnerabilities, especially when it's caused by external factors. And it was extremely unpopular. But I used to be in the private sector, and there's always the cyclical nature of any market for that matter. And the trick was always to build your resilience and to be stronger when it is down. Because what is down is bound to go up. And the best of the companies are the ones that have built their capacity and resilience during the downturn, because as it picks up, they are the ones that will reap the best benefit. And in that sense, I think Malaysian governments and all our agencies had focused on the right prescriptions. Our monetary response to the tumbling down of ringgit was not to raise interest rates, just like our neighbors did, but we focus on the right policies that we think will be able to convince the market that we have the best growth narrative in this region. Because as and when the market corrects itself and the upside is coming, obviously we stand to benefit as the most attractive market in this region. And because of that, we've rolled out successive small policy packets. And there was also a different approach that we have taken. Malaysia was so used to big plans. Obviously, we have our 5-year plan, but successive governments had rolled out big ambitions and big plans. And while a lot of effort was put in, and the diagnosis usually was very correct, but because of the long-term nature of any big plan, 2, 3, 4 years into the plan, usually you will encounter new problems, new developments that was not factored in, and therefore the implementation went haywire. So we focused in the last 20 months, and we intend to continue in the same approach of focusing on what we call a slow release approach to policy making. We focus on one structural issue, don't spend too much time building up a plan, because more or less we know the diagnosis. The report from OECD, the report from World Bank, whatever reports that we develop ourselves more or less pointed out to the same conclusion. What we need to do was to focus on that 20% of policy intervention that can have the 80% effect on managing the structural issues. And we could do that faster by rolling out small packets or very sectoral focused policy documents. And hence, we've rolled out the National Energy Transition Roadmap on energy transition, followed by New Industrial Master Plan. And then we also rolled out KL20, which is the action plan on startups and digital economy and high-tech. And we will continue to do that one after another in the next 2 to 3 years. Ladies and gentlemen, all of this, as I mentioned in the beginning, the challenge of policy making, especially in turning around an economy, it does take some time. And therefore, it is very important to give a glimpse of what we could be through a rather more radical product that we offer to our stakeholders. And that was the basis of the Johor-Singapore Special Economic Zone that we've been working on. And while we've been busy managing the macro structural issue behind closed doors, one of the initiatives that really took off and excite the investors was Johor-Singapore Special Economic Zone. And if anything, it is a microcosm of our ambitions, which is to be pragmatic, to be practical, and to put aside all the legacy issues, and to understand that as a small market, Malaysia is a relatively small market. We can only reach for higher growth if we begin to leverage on our geography and competitive advantage to be more than the sum of our parts. And while it is a common sense to the world, it is actually very difficult to convince both Malaysians and Singapore, and to say that, you know what, it is better for us to work together and to complement each other and see and harness the synergy between the two, because it's a common sense. And so far, I was very shocked to see the coverage, because it was meant to be just a small thing. But in all our interface with investors and seeing the analysts, it's quite obvious that the analyst coverage has been so widespread precisely because it's a common sense. And if successful, JSSEZ won't be a model just for Malaysia, but it is also a test case for us to build a greater economic integration across ASEAN. Because we know enough, in the next 10 to 15 years, ASEAN is going to be a formidable consumer market. Unlike China, with its size, ASEAN is rather fragmented. Most probably, investors in New York or Japan or London do not appreciate enough that while you may be in an ASEAN country, but is totally different if you end up in Manila than in Kuala Lumpur. And because of that, given the 10-15 years trajectory that we have to see and grow ASEAN as perhaps the 4th largest consumer market in the world, it is very important to begin the integration as soon as possible. And I think the world is taking notice of that. What began with a renewed interest in semiconductors turned into a rush for data centers. And I hope my team from Ministry of Economy, from across the ministries and agencies, will continue to run this marathon to craft a compelling growth story for our stakeholders around the world. And the essence of it is very simple, that when you synthesize political stability and certainty, a welcoming trade and investment position, and if the government has the will to implement forward-looking policies, an economic turnaround doesn't seem to be impossible. Of course, we have all the issues that have been highlighted. Some are easier to manage. Some we have just begun to chart the path. And one of the key focus of the next 5-year plan is to start the ball rolling on planning for aging nation and the expected age nation that will not come too far from now. Malaysia is expected to be an aged nation in 2044, and most probably I will still be alive by then. So I would like to see that as we cross 2044, wherever I am or wherever I will be in 2044, we can look back and say we've done the right things in the 2020s, because Malaysia hopefully will be able to manage that challenge come 2040s and 2050s. And if anything, I hope we can continue the optimism that the market has been pointing for the last 6 months of the year, that Malaysia is a rising economy once more. And I would be very cautious to say this. As I point out, we are still very much vulnerable to so many developments that are not in our control. But I think it does give a sense that we are now heading in the right direction. And of course, the burden is to sustain that pace. I give you one example. All the growth narratives that we've been selling to investors in the last 20 months obviously had attracted rather successfully a flow of foreign investments. But that will create another set of problems for us, especially in managing the demand for energy in this country. At the time, we have to manage it sustainably. And obviously, we will also have to contend that with the growing demand, growing investments, there will come a heavy spotlight on our ability to solve bottlenecks in talent and bureaucracy. And I used to run organization on the extreme end of the private sector, from the largest to a startup. And the biggest challenge when it comes to talent is obviously more acute with our MSMEs. And while they contribute almost 40% to GDP, when we talk about macroeconomic planning and macro policy, we have a problem in this country, because while the policy design can take effect with the larger companies, they can absorb and they can pivot with new policy designs prescribed by the government, but that ability is very much limited with the MSMEs because of the talent crunch, because of the cash flow crunch, because of the market access. And because of that, the barrier to scale up, as pointed out in the OECD report, is due to so many things, but among the easiest that we can focus, which is in the government's control, is with regards to burdensome regulations. And if this continue, obviously we will continuously cap Malaysia's potential for homegrown businesses, and by extension our own talent. So the good thing is this, while the OECD report was prepared, it's almost like a year ago that it started, we've also started evaluating our own processes and regulations. And the government has made a few radical decisions, and that includes rolling out something of a government efficiency commitment act, which is going to be the first in our history where government will commit to a steady reduction of regulations, and this is going to be legislated and committed in Parliament, and that will bind agencies and ministries to make sure, for example, for every one regulation that is put in, take one regulation out. And this kind of legislation is actually quite common in other countries. Of course, we will develop it in such a way that we don't rock the boat too much here. But I do feel that it is going to be the first important step for us to manage our regulations, and in doing so, it will be one of an important policy levers for the government to assist MSMEs to scale up. And we plan to table the act by end of the year, and again, by Malaysian standard, Dr. Louis, Ms. Karima knows, by Malaysian standard, there is going to be a record-setting pace. Because usually it takes about 4 years to legislate in this country. But I don't think we can wait. And a lot of what we can do are low-hanging fruits that we feel if we all come together, focus on the delivery, understand the intention, then we will be able to pull this off rather quickly, much in the same way that we've been able to pitch our growth narrative to the world in the last 20 months. I hope our responsibility as a rising economy is also understood, because with a rise in economy comes a responsibility, and this responsibility comes in twofold. Obviously, to ensure that our people are getting the best deal possible at every facet of society, that's given. But we also want to wield this new responsibility with independence, that we hope, and our aspiration is that even as the world is retreating within, and we do see this in some parts of the world, Malaysia wants to stand boldly in promoting trade, investments and partnership with as many people as possible, across many layers as possible, as a means to lift the many. So with that, I would like to reiterate the government's commitment to this very fruitful relationship with OECD, and to thank every stakeholder that had played a role in this year's survey. It is customary. Apparently, I have to officially launch the report. I think whether I officially launch the report or not, I think a lot of people out there will be pouring and to see, especially the findings on MSME. And I hope all of us will take the report to our hearts, go back, use it with our respective stakeholders, and come on board with this mission, and focus especially on scaling up our MSMEs in the next 5 to 10 years. With that, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Wabi Rafizi, for the keynote address. I would like to ask Wabi Rafizi to kindly remain on the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached to the main highlight of our event this afternoon, the launching of the 2024 OECD Economic Surveys Malaysia. I would like to invite Yang Berbahagia Dato' Dr. Zunika Mohammed, as well as Dr. Luis Dimelo to join YB Rafizi on stage for the launching session. I would like to invite Yang Berhormat Rafizi Ramli, Dr. Zunika, and Dr. Luis Di Melo, as well as all distinguished guests to watch a video montage of the 2024 OECD Economic Surveys Malaysia. Dr. Luis Di Melo to hand over the 2024 OECD Economic Surveys Malaysia report to Yang Berbahagia, Yang Berhormat Rafizi Ramli, Minister of Economy. Now I would like to invite YB Rafizi Ramli, Minister of Economy, accompanied by Dr. Zunika, to hand over token of appreciation to Dr. Luis Di Melo.